Hi folks. I wanted to say a few words this week about the Vietnam War, which was the conflict that was going on as my brother and I came of age. And my parents, I can recall, talked to us about the prospect of us going to fight in Vietnam if the war kept continuing onward. And they were ticking away the years basically until my older brother would be eligible for the draft. And then soon thereafter, I would have registered and potentially would have gone as well. And in our family, my father and all my uncles served in the Second World War. And my family was, my parents were really torn about the prospect of us serving in Southeast Asia. The war was not going well. It was certainly morally more cloudy, I think, for many Americans in terms of the ethics of the struggle compared to the Second World War, in which the United States was actually attacked by a foreign foe. And so in our household, there was the expectation that if the war was still going on and we were drafted or we were eligible, that we would all go. And in fact, my mother's best friend at that time period had two sons, and one of them joined the U.S. Navy, went to Vietnam, and basically was returned after his death. And my mother attended the funeral, and she didn't allow us to go. I think that it was probably too much for her to have her sons there at the funeral of the son of her best friend who had died in Vietnam. And so much has been written about the Vietnam War and the mistakes that were made, the sort of assumptions and sort of poor logic that was utilized in deepening American involvement. And in essence, that was a war that destroyed two American presidencies, Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon as well. So an entire generation of people in this country were torn apart during the 60s and 70s, either supporting the war or opposing it. And so in our family, actually, my father-in-law did go to Vietnam. He was also the son of a World War II veteran. My dad was actually fairly young, went to war as a teenager, and my father-in-law's father was much older. But both of them served in the same war. And my father-in-law actually volunteered to go. He took seriously the call by President Kennedy to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And so my father-in-law volunteered, served 2 tours in Vietnam, and he and the men that he served with, I think in the 60s, they really believed that they were there to do good, that they were traveling halfway around the world to help the South Vietnamese people maintain their freedom and liberty and to resist the spread of communism. And so my father-in-law left on a very idealistic young man, and 2 years later he returned, I think, very affected by the war. I think his idealism had turned to real doubts and real sarcasm about the conflict. And he told a lot of stories about sort of the irrationality during the Vietnam War, that there was a case where he and his unit were ordered to fly a rescue mission into the Mekong River Delta. There was a flood of the river, and villages were covered in water, and people were basically in need of food and rescue. And so my father-in-law loaded up his helicopter with 100-pound sacks of rice, and he flew south and westward into the Mekong River Valley, and they found the villages they were looking for, and they hovered probably over 1,000 feet above the ground, because that area was largely under the control of the Viet Cong, and you would take ground fire apparently from the enemy. And so my father-in-law, he hovered way off the ground, and his crew chief went in the back and kicked out the bags of rice, and my father-in-law said they tumbled through the air, and they struck the rooftops of these villagers' homes, which the roofs were made of thatch, and so these heavy bags of rice went through the roofs down into the floodwater where they were contaminated, and then nobody could use them or eat them. And so then my father-in-law flew back to base, and he said about 2 weeks later, some high-ranking officers showed up. They lined up the men on the tarmac, and they pinned medals on them. And this was sort of a PR or public relations event. Look at the good work that we're doing in Vietnam. And of course, my father-in-law knew that the entire mission had been a waste of time. But it was experiences like that that led to his pessimism and questioning about the logic and the reason and the rationality of the war in Southeast Asia. And of course, that war influenced the thinking of generations of later military officers. If you study the tactics that are used later in the Iraq War, you'll find that those senior officers had all served in Vietnam, and they very intentionally set out to avoid some of the fundamental mistakes that were made back in the 60s and 70s. So we're nearly done with week 6. We've got just a couple of more weeks until the term is going to be over with. So keep plugging away, and soon we'll get at least some rest. I think the next term starts almost immediately, but it feels good to get through with another cycle and see most people doing fairly well. So I will talk to you folks later.